Very warm welcome to this session, which is around improving crop species diversity in a farmed environment. So just to introduce myself, my name is Belinda Clarke. I run Agritech E, which is a membership organisation connecting innovators and farmers and growers and those who want to move the needle in terms of productivity and sustainability in agriculture and horticulture. So it's my very great pleasure to be invited to chair this session today, where we're going to be looking at crop diversity and really the role of agronomy and or microbial inoculum, all the practices that can really support maximising the potential of this crop species diversity on farm. So we have a lineup of three excellent speakers. I'm very much looking forward to hearing from them today. A very strong representation from NIAB, which I hope most of you know has a very strong presence in Cambridge, also is very active on farms and sites research trials across the UK. We're going to be hearing mainly from Lydia Smith to start with, who I have to say this whole session is Lydia's brainchild. She'll be talking about a project that she's been working on and really sort of setting the scene for the crop species diversity conversation. We'll then be hearing from Jim Orson, who I hope many of you know. I certainly have known Jim for many years, and it's been an absolute pleasure to sit at the feet of the guru. He calls himself retired, but I think he's still very busy at the moment, thankfully, in the ecosystem, and we're still going to benefit from his wisdom this afternoon. And then Syed Shah, who's regional agronomist from NIAB, who's going to be sharing some data around biostimulants and microbial inocular to look at how that's been impacting across different crop species. So a little bit of housekeeping. We want this session to inspire you, we want it to inform you, we want it to educate. We'd like some challenge and debate, as is the framing of this conference. Keep your challenges respectful. You may not agree, that's great, that's fine. Let's have the conversation, but please stay kind and respectful to each other. We all need that in these interesting and challenging times. So if you have a question, please could you post it in the Q&A. We have in the back office, we have two people from the conference who will be keeping us on the straight and narrow. And this session is due to run from now until 3:30, that's 15:30 GMT this afternoon. So without further ado, I would like to invite our first speaker, Lydia Smith, if you'd like to join me. Hi, nice to see you, Lydia. Lydia heads up Innovation Farm and runs the Eastern Agritech Innovation Hub in the east of England. Lydia, I won't steal your thunder with any more introductions, and I'll pass the talking stick to you.
Thank you very much, Belinda. I'm just going to share my screen, and don't go away. Let's just make sure that it works. Hooray. Okay, thanks very much to the Oxford Real Farming Conference to supporting this session. Now, so I want to talk about what we can do in terms of improving crop species diversity. Lots of talks today, and they're wonderful, are looking at non-crop species diversity, but let's have a look at how we can impact on the farmed environment. And I think this is really important, not just because we need different crops fulfilling different niches and using the soil differently. But I think also, you know, there are some services, ecosystem services, that are provided by different crops. And if we are absolutely stuck with a very narrow number of species, we minimize the chance that we can do that. So where are we at? And this is very much a scene setting, as Belinda said. Of the estimated 369,400 flowering crops, only about 7,000 have been cultivated. And gosh, it would be great if we had as many as that cultivated around England. But 80% of plant-derived food comes from 17 out of 452 plant families. And then bring it even down more to specific delivery. 30 crops really underpin our food. And within the UK itself, we're really looking at very fine level of minimal diversity. So 75% of the UK's 4.5 million hectares is pretty much dominated by wheat, barley and oilseed rape. Probably lots of you know this, and a little bit of grain and legumes coming in at the bottom. So not only do we not have a very diverse environment, potentially dependence on this very narrow number highlights a risk of nutritional security and agricultural resilience. And there's lots of opportunities and risks within this scenario. So breeding gains and agronomic advances have supported productivity. So if you have a look at the graph on the right there, we've had great improvement over the years, but really since the 1990s, a lot of those improvements, particularly in genetics, have sort of bottomed out, and we're not really getting the kind of improvements that we were seeing in the sort of 60s, 70s, 80s. Climate change is also impacting on this, extreme weather, pest, disease, and other issues, and loss of agrichem, which I guess Syed will talk about a bit later as well, and Jim. So we need to be able to tackle different scenarios now. And I think genetically diverse plants and crop rotations gives us that resilience and environmental benefits and potentially improved human nutrition. So the climate change challenge will alter the balance of carbon capture versus greenhouse gas release. And we also want to look at what's the potential for sequestering carbon dioxide and minimizing the sort of the downside of those other greenhouse gases like the nitrous oxides and so forth. So we want to look at maximizing crop production and different methods, and probably looking at minimizing things like tillage so that we've got the potential to use things like catch and cover crops and recycling some of those residues back and enabling good soil quality and health going forward. So we've been looking at NIAB, and very much assisted by our grains at SRUC, at what is the potential out there for sort of expanding that number of crops that we're working with. So we've got together a long list of 193 potential crops divided into cereals and grains, oilseeds and seeds, grain legumes, forage and forage legumes as a sort of general group, and then fruit, vines, nuts, and various vegetables. In fact, in the last one, we probably could have added even more vegetables, but we were trying to keep it to crops that really had any sort of potential within the UK environment. So having got that big list, we then are looking at whittling it down to a short list of the most likely successful crops that we could look at introducing, either with a bit with minimal input, or perhaps with a bit of a solid research and development background. And we've done some workshops already to get a feel for what farmers think, what they've tried, what's failed, what has succeeded. And we've looked at trying to get an idea of what the shortlisting sort of options are that can give us a feel for which of these are likely to succeed. So we came up with 5 main categories. You can see them there on the left: crop suitability, ease of cultivation, economic potential, knowledge generally about the crop and resources, and environmental impact. And then within those, 15 key criteria that would be considered sort of within those main categories. And then we sort of put this to a group of farmers that we pulled together in a series of online workshops, and had a bit sort of discussion about other things that we might have missed and all the specific things within each of those criteria. So if you just take, for example, pollution risk, number 14 there, what are the different pollution risks? We're looking at the greenhouse gases, obviously, diffuse pollution, heavy metal pollution, all these sorts of things that we might be considering when we're looking at a new crop. And so these are the so-called indicators, and looking at things that will relate to suitability, potential, and so forth. We looked at crops right across the piece, as I said. We don't have an exhaustive list, but we're trying to be as exhaustive as we can. And we're looking at whether those criteria and indicators are different for the different types of crops. So after our first sort of poll of what the farmers thought, we came up with some, for example, you can see them highlighted there: climate, agronomy, and market and utilization were considered particularly important and needed extra weighting when considering whether a new crop might be a goer. And then we looked at things like indicators that also might be particularly interesting. And within one of the workshops, again, you can see some of the ones that came out as very high priority for a lot of our farmer respondents, like weather extremes, like the type of soil that you're able to do, whether you can access crops that will deal with shallow soils or saline soils, and harvest window and rotations. So looking specifically now, sort of honing down on the different crop groups, we have a parallel project actually called Foraging, where we asked farmers things like, what have you looked at so far? And how would you compare them to the kind of key reference, which we chose perennial ryegrass, as you wouldn't be surprised to know. Thanks to Ellie, by the way, who organised all this. So what are your biggest challenges, we asked? And as you can see there, some of the big ones that were flagged up straight away were weather, be it too wet or too dry. And probably the third after that was weed issues. And this is, as I say, specifically within the forage area. And then we said, okay, which are the ones of all the kind of long list of forage crops that you think might be up for a bit of help and a bit of development to improve their status within the farmed environment? Saffron, I was really pleased to hear, came out as quite a front runner. So you can see there's all sorts of different criteria now that we asked them about. And so if you're getting a turquoise or an orange colour, then they're coming out potentially better than the lolium comparator. Another one that came out pretty well, perhaps not quite as high as Sandpoint, is Festuloleum. This is one of these mixtures between Festuca and Lolium. Okay, moving on to combinable and field crops, and I've just managed to squeeze in all of the long list here, and you can see there's some quite wacky ones which probably won't stand much of a chance. Narbonne bean at the top there, for example, I don't think has probably got much of a chance at the moment, but there were a few that I'm just going to actually take out and discuss some of the things that we would be considering. Okay, so first of all, soya. So I actually was involved in a project in this a little while ago, and on the left there you can see David McNulty from Soya UK. Soya, I think, has got a lot of potential. It's it hadn't probably 10, 15 years ago, but now as a varietal development has gone on, lots of potential to introduce it now that the cool tolerance and so the time of drilling has come a little bit back from the sort of very mid of the summer to kind of a bit earlier in the summer to late spring. Still some way to go, I think, on soya. Here's another one that NIAB's worked on, Artemisia Annual. Well, I don't think we're ever going to get huge acreage of Artemisia, but we found that it's a potential crop for the UK. This is a very specialist crop that produces feedstocks for treating malaria, and we were concentrating on pushing up that active ingredient. Small amounts. Here's another one. Some people would say that this was a very wacky one, but actually over the last 10, 15 years, this has gone from a complete outsider to a real crop that quite a few farmers are now growing. It's a specialist oil crop. It's got a high quality omega-3 stearidonic acid content and really nice potential great crop with lots of agronomy taken into account. And here's a quick sort of whiz through where you go, seed evaluation, getting the varieties right and processing it. And finally, in my short list, a completely different one that I think also has got lots of potential going forward, hemp, which has really nice gross margin potential at the moment even, and perhaps maybe in the future, if we were able to grow hemp for things like CBD, we could get even better outcome from growing this crop. And I think all of these crops, not just hemp, but all those in the long list and ones that will eventually get onto the short list, we need them to deal with things like blackgrass, which is increasingly a problem in cereals, like the cabbage stem flea beetle, and in the case of hemp particularly, that can deal with these sorts of carbon sequestration issues. And in another poll where we asked farmers, what would you think, we asked about all crops, but this is particular to hemp, what do you think about growing it in the future? And there was lots of strength in how they would like to get involved with that. So we've got future workshops. This is an ongoing piece of work. We're trying to find out what farmers think, what are the issues? We certainly won't have thought of all of them. So if you'd like to come and get in touch with us, please do. We've got workshops happening in February. And I hope that has set the scene for what my colleagues are going to say about all the kinds of issues that inevitably we will encounter when considering these new kinds of crops. Thanks very much to my partners, by the way. This is not my project. I'm working with a big team of experts, especially Stuart Knight at NIAB, who's leading some of the work. And I am going to hand back to Belinda, I hope in good time, to take us on to the next stage.
Thank you very much, Lydia. There was a question in the chat, and thank you for those who've answered the question. Just a question about elms, and there's been a kind of one-liner suggestion or explanation about that. Do you want to? I mean, I guess the project that you've been doing was really inspired by DEFRA's quite long-standing thinking around the transition into elms, was it not? Which is, well, do you want to just set the scene for elms and the role of this project within it?
Yeah, so there's quite a lot of different projects going on at NIAB. Some of them are supported by DEFRA. DEFRA certainly is helping us with looking at these underutilised crops in particular. And yes, there's a number of things. So the need for greater resilience, the need to deal with things like loss of chemistry, and to enable resilience within the system, so that farmers can come away from the crop specific payments and actually look at how we can deliver the kinds of things which we're going to be doing under elm, which is very, very different. And so, to have a look at biodiversity improvements, at carbon sequestration improvements, and at soil improvements, these are all components of elm as it goes forward, as well as crop quality and security. And I think that sustainable cropping in the environment it's been for years, of course, at the very top of farmers' priorities, but to enable farmers to do that and for a greater number of potential crops just makes the whole thing possible at a higher level, I think. And so this is the thinking, as you rightly say, behind what DEFRA would like to see. Let's help farmers to do the things that we all want to do.
Absolutely. I think the sort of the mantra almost for elm has been public money for public goods, hasn't it? So I guess and we'll come on to this in the discussion, hopefully, the sort of tacit assumption that increasing the diversity of species will contribute to public goods in whatever way, as yet not quite defined. Is that fair to say?
Yes, it's a tricky one, isn't it? Until these things really come on stream, you never quite know precisely how they'll pan out. But if you have a certain level of equipment which will only deal with wheat, barley, and oilseed rape, as I said at the beginning, and you're really struggling with blackgrass. I mean, there are some parts of the east of England where it's one of my old colleague Ron Stobart described it as not just a bit of volunteers, but practically a lawn. When there's difficult soil situations, and it's an unsustainable situation going forward. And so, if you can introduce crops that are not members of the Gramineaceae at all, then even within an abbreviated set of crop chemistry or ways of dealing with it, if you're an organic farmer, there's just got to be more potential of dealing with those issues sustainably and economically. And let's forget that all farmers are business people, be they men or women, and they have to make a profit whilst at the same time delivering sustainable outcomes as are required within the sort of new elm scheme.
Yeah, just one question, and I appreciate that this isn't necessarily your area of expertise, but is there any interest in the project of thinking about the opportunities for those crops around, I think you mentioned in your talk, human nutrition, but also animal nutrition? Is that within scope?
Oh, absolutely. So
Okay.
Not only is foraging, which is, I think, run by Ellie Sweetman, I'm not 100% sure, looking at diversity right across the forage set, but within the work that we're doing specifically on underutilised crops, so going back and looking at crops that haven't been grown very, very much for years, or completely new ones, that we can introduce from other parts of the world. So yes, looking at not just quantity, it's not all about quantity, but about quality and about animal husbandry and about animal welfare. And, you know, so if you're introducing crops like, well, I'm going to say sandfoin, obviously, which those that know me know that I've worked on sandfoin for many years, but it's got anthelmintic qualities, which will give you ways of dealing with parasitic burden, which is very unpleasant for the animal, as well as being deleterious to the delivery of the outcomes. And so I was in a session earlier, actually, we were looking at some of these mixed swards, which have got multiple ways of delivering animal welfare without chemical inputs, which is great for everybody because the animal feels good and the inputs are cheaper for the farmer.
Brilliant. Okay, it would be good to maybe come back to this in the panel discussion. So just again to remind delegates, if this has inspired any additional questions or indeed about sandfoin, because we have with us probably the world's founder member of the sandfoin fan club. Lydia has evangelized about this crop for a very long time, and rightly so. Please pop your comments or questions in the chat and we'll come back to them in the panel discussion after we've heard from Jim and Syed. So for now, Lydia, thank you very much. And if I can invite Jim to turn on your camera and microphone and join me. Hello, Jim, lovely to see you again. How are you?
I'm very well.
Good, good. Now, Jim, you describe yourself as retired, but experts like you carry on, and that knowledge needs to be disseminated still, and we're very fortunate to have you with us this afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to pass the talking stick to you and very much look forward to hearing your talk. So over to you, please.
Okay, Belinda, thank you very much, and thanks for the invite to attend and speak at this conference. I think I'll start by sharing my screen, which, right, I thought to start with a touch of class. And obviously, as you can see, I'm well retired, well past my sell-by date in many ways. And what do retired people do? They go on lots of holidays. And I was on a holiday 5 or 6 years ago with my wife in Saint-Rémy, which is in Provence, in France. And we walked through a big, large, protected woodland area to the south of the town, and came out of the woods to see the hospital in which Van Gogh was hospitalized in the late 1880s. And he painted a picture of a scene of a wheat field, and here it is. The wheat field being a small area in between rocks, where possibly soil erosion over the centuries had created a bit more topsoil, sufficient to grow wheat. And then, to my surprise, I found that this picture was located in the woodland which we just walked through. So what had happened is subsistence agriculture in the 1880s eventually subsided, went away, and there was a rewilding project by nature, and it's now natural woodland, and a noted natural woodland in the south of France. So subsistence agriculture gave away to a rewilding project. And of course, if you look around the world, there's other areas where you can see subsistence agriculture grabbing a little tiny share of a natural environment, just like that wheat crop. And this is obviously in Asia, and it's obviously rice. But obviously it is also replacing natural vegetation. And these pictures really reinforce my thoughts that it is high yielding agriculture that will deliver the combination of food supply and biodiversity benefits in the future. And this is the view of the overwhelming majority of high impact journals on this study, on this subject. So I think we need to think about that in the background to the rest of my talk, which is going to be on the motivation for rotational change over the last few decades. So we'll start with the 1950s and 1960s. People consider that the 1950s and 60s was great, lovely soil structure and things like that. The soil structure in the late 1960s was appalling and arable farms, so much so that the MAF, or the DEFRA of today, commissioned the Strutt report to investigate what we could do about the appalling soil structure of farming at the time. And part of this was obviously the debate about organic matter. Now, this is a picture of some results of a trial looking at how lays influenced organic matter. It's a 12-year trial, bottom scale. You can see 3, 6, 9, and 12. And if you just look at the end, don't get really sort of taken away by the rest of it. But if you look on the right-hand side, you can see that the top line is a 9-year lay. So we started 3 years, we already had 3 years lay, 6. Organic matter built up nicely for a 9-year lay, and then plummeted with 3 years arable agriculture. The second line down is a 3-year lay. So the 3 years lay, 3 years arable, 3 years lay, 3 years arable, ending up much the same organic matter. And then we had lucerne, 3 years lucerne, 3 years arable, 3 years lucerne, 3 years arable, and barely any advantage in terms of organic matter compared to the bottom line, which was continuous arable agriculture. Now, the lucerne results are reflected elsewhere in the world that lucerne doesn't appear to add much to organic matter. And also elsewhere in the UK, at least, the results of this one trial near Cambridge at Boxworth reflect other trials similar to the Rothamsted experiment, which was 3 years lay, 2 years arable, which added about 10% in organic matter, an increase of 10%, not by 10%, of 10%. So you can have an awful lot of lays with seemingly little advantage in terms of organic matter. And this had a profound influence, I think, the results of this and other trials, on the thoughts of people, advisors and farmers, considering what rotations to follow in the 60s, at least, late 60s and early 70s. In addition, the farmers at that time were having to cope with less labour on the land, more machinery, expensive machinery, and therefore they tended to concentrate on a few crops to keep their machinery costs down. So there was an economic need in many cases to reduce the number of crops and probably avoid lays and livestock altogether. And this type of result probably gave them solace that they weren't doing too bad a job by dropping lays. I think what we failed to recognise at the time was that even a marginal increase in organic matter can have a disproportionate benefit on soil health. But I think that got lost in the wider arguments about specialisation of cropping. And also, we have to reflect on this in terms of today's agriculture. Our crops are bigger nowadays, returning more plant residues to the soil. So what would that do to these results of 50, 60 years ago? And also, the arable crops were ploughed annually, heavily cultivated. What happens if you had minimum tillage after lays nowadays? That would reduce probably carbon loss, and there might be a bigger advantage to having a lay. I'm trying to persuade Lydia to do this in one of her experiments. So we went forward with a view that lathes were not necessarily important to soil health, and we could concentrate on arable cropping. And here we see the advent of technology in an input management from 1970s onwards. As I say, 1970s soils were in a terrible state in many cases, and this was because of the old friend blackgrass. Farmers were not actually sowing wheat until probably mid-November to avoid blackgrass because they didn't have the herbicides. So when herbicides came along, they could control blackgrass very effectively, averaging 99% control of some of these herbicides when they were introduced. In the early 70s, they set the scene for earlier drilling when the soils were drier and in better health. And in many cases, we saw improvements in soil health because people were avoiding having to drill winter crops in mid-November. So that was one of the big breakthroughs of the 1970s. Then, of course, we had the breeding improvements, the semi-dwarf wheats, which put a higher proportion of grain in the ear rather than the straw, and the crops stood better. And also there were growth regulators even then. Then we had effective fungicides coming along to control diseases, which are often associated with higher rates of nitrogen. And we had a system which resulted in increases in yield of wheat. And because wheat was a big money earner, it's something we could compete with on the world market. The area of wheat doubled, as well as the yields doubled. So between 1971 and 1991, wheat production increased fourfold. So a tremendous technical breakthrough, you would think. But of course, as we all know, we saw this plateauing in wheat in the mid-1990s onwards. So people were getting a bit frustrated about having seen what they've been through the last 20 years, why the wheat yields were plateauing, and also problems were increasing. And going back to blackgrass, we begin to see pesticide resistance or herbicide resistance to blackgrass. And this is making things not only difficult for farmers, particularly on the clays, but also very expensive indeed. So there were issues about the reasons for the plateauing. And this is just one result of a trial in North Norfolk by Nayab Tag, which demonstrates that the more intensively you grow oilseed rape, the lower the yield. So that's virgin rape compared to rape 1 in 3 years, alternate rape wheat, which many farmers are doing at the time, compared to continuous rape, and progressively yields got lower. So yields seem to be associated to a certain extent to the intensity of the crops you were growing. And so one farmer who was at the sort of spearhead of this was the Saul estate near Norwich, 2,000 hectares of medium soils, frustrated at the late 90s about the lack of further increase in yields, frustrated by the inability to control blackgrass in a largely wheat oilseed rape dominated rotation. So he revised the his rotation away to a 7-course rotation. And this was still growing a lot of wheat, introducing spring beets, more role for sugar beets, spring crops to break the blackgrass life cycle. And I will show you the results of that in terms of the all-important yields later. He was already using organic manures prior to that, so that's no different. He's now using cover crops, as you can see, two lots of cover crops and a 7-year rotation. He's only introduced those over the last 10 years. He uses glyphosate to burn them off. The cultivations are shallow. Usually 5 to 10 centimetres, a bit deeper for sugar beet. And all importantly, this rotation allows them to use glyphosate only once in 7 years for weed control. And this he feels is important in terms of retaining glyphosate activity should resistance come along. So that's the rotation, not revolutionary, but a bigger spread of crops and less intensive growing, particularly of oilseed rape, which was often 1 in 3 at the time. Now, in terms of yields, he broke out of his plateau and his yields increased, his wheat yields increased by about 0.1 of a tonne per hectare a year over the next 20 years. So he increased his average yields by about 2 tonnes a hectare compared to both regional and national trends, which were largely flat. Now, we can't all say that's all due to a diversified rotation, but certainly it must have been a major contributor to him breaking out of his yield plateau. And it was not only in wheat that he increased yields, but also spring barley, where he also increased his yields very significantly indeed. And these two graphs, if you looked at them long enough, would probably suggest that overall, although he was growing some traditionally low yielding crops more in his rotation, his overall output increased because all the crops in the rotation benefited from the change in rotation and other issues. So he's increased his overall output, increased his yields. I think there are signs that the winter wheat yields and the spring barley yields are levelling off to a new higher plateau. And you've got to hit a plateau sometime. The interesting thing is oilseed rape, which I haven't shown, which was increasing nicely until the ban on neonic seed dressings came along, and yields have suffered because of that in the recent years. So it's not such an impressive thing. A good start in terms of the rotation, new rotation, wider rotation, but a poor end because of the neonic seed dressing ban. So here is an argument on just one farm possibly, but I've seen it repeated on others, of widening the rotation and also reducing the costs, because obviously he's not spending such a fortune on blackgrass. It's still there. It's still a nagging issue on in terms of blackgrass, but the rotation has broken it as a major and expensive problem. So there is an argument we should be looking for alternative crops, like Lydia said, to improve the overall productivity of the industry, particularly on clay soils, where cropping opportunities are reduced. The soil estates is on a medium soil where you can grow sugar beet without much problem, although sugar beet can be a problem. So we do need an alternative range of crops. Now, over the years, I've looked at a few of alternative crops. 15 years ago, I looked at soya, and at that time in North Norfolk, where I was, which is not the sunniest part of the world, we never came to harvest over 2 years, and we gave it up. I tried lentils, would you believe, in the 1970s, and again, I don't think the crop breeding was sufficient to produce a good crop at the end of the season. And I've looked at sunflowers, which in many ways is potentially a good crop for heavy land, large seed, which you probably need on heavy land, with drilling in spring, with poorer seed beds. And its harvest date was coming forward then 20 years ago, but we gave it up at the end. But presumably nowadays, with better plant breeding, that must come back into an option. So if I was a farmer now looking for a perfect alternative crop, particularly on a clay, for my system, I'll be asking some of these questions. It needs to be sown when the soil is likely to be moist and warm, which means midsummer sowing would be out, certainly in the eastern counties, because it's often too dry. It needs to be harvested before the soils become too wet in the late autumn, particularly on the clays. You don't need specialist equipment. If it's a limited market crop, it needs long-term contracts. And also there is issues about no weed or disease control issues, and not difficult to control the volunteers from it as well. And also, ideally, I should say, no disease carryover that would affect other crops in the rotation. I've talked about the appropriate size seed freezer sowing establishment, particularly on clays. And in these days, it should be ideally suited to minimum tillage where carbon pavements are being harvested. So that's my little review of the motivations of changing rotations over the last few years. As I said to start with, I think we did not realise the importance of even marginal increase of organic matter in the 60s, but certainly herbicides did improve soil structure through earlier sowing in dry soils until we hit the blackgrass problem in the late 60s. And since then, people are trying to diversify their rotations, but they are limited on heavy soils and would love to see more options. So thank you. I shall now stop sharing. And are there any questions? Have we got time for questions, Belinda?
Any questions of clarification on Jim's talk, if anyone would like to post them in the Q&A. I have a question, Jim. I love your final sort of almost a wish list for Father Christmas, your perfect crop. I mean, you've got a lot of experience of a lot of different types of crops. Is that a list that you would give to a breeder? How confident are you that such a crop will exist ever? Is that realistic, or are these guidelines at this stage?
Well, no, I do think they're I mean, that's the ideal, and farmers. But when you look at wheat, barley, oilseed rape, they all fit that list, don't they?
Yeah.
Yeah. So what we need to get other crops to do that, and that can only be done by breeding, I think. Yeah. So I'm not going to say about breeding method, but certainly. I think I've seen improvements in sunflowers over the last few years, and also we have got climate change as well. And sure. There's two crops that's benefited from climate change, sugar beet and grain maize. And they are both yielding better nowadays, not only through plant breeding, but also a longer growing season.
Yeah.
And so I think, that there must be alternatives out there with a bit of breeding effort. We might have one or two winners in the future.
Brilliant. I'd like to come back to the breeding conversation a bit later on in the panel session. But for now, final call. Anyone who has any questions for Jim will come back in the panel discussion, but please do post them in the Q&A. But for now, Jim, thank you so much. Pleasure to hear from you. See you in a bit. So now I'd like to invite Syed Shah to turn your camera on, please, Syed. And you are based at NIAB, aren't you, as an agronomist? And this is a fascinating piece of work that you've been undertaking around the role of biostimulants. So really looking forward to you walking us through this. So Syed, over to you.
Thank you very much, Belinda, and I hope you can hear me. So what I'm going to discuss is the role of biostimulants and whether we can use them in crops which I feel that they are underutilized. Now, it could be quite subjective. What I might say is underutilized, maybe a main crop for some other people. So I just thought maybe very briefly introduce why break crops are important and biostimulants, what are they? Why do we need them? There are a range of biostimulants. And I have been working on biostimulants over the last 10 years. And what's the current and future legislation on biostimulants? But range of topics, but I just thought maybe very quickly highlight why do we need break crop? So I think Jim has already covered a bit of the slides anyway. So question is, what is break crop? So I would say break crop is any crop which we grow, which is from a different family or maybe from different species. So if we grow wheat, barley, and maybe spring barley, winter wheat, winter barley, maybe spring barley, they are from same families. Therefore, they are, although they are different crops, but they are from same family, so they will have a different effect on the yield. So if you look at on my left-hand side, where we had oilseed rape, so in green color, which is actually the yield of first wheat, which means wheat which was grown after oilseed rape, and then the orange color bar is actually second wheat. So you can see huge difference in the yield after oilseed rape, for example. So if you do have a different crops in the rotation, for example, beans and linseed, they tend to produce, winter wheat tends to produce slightly better yield if the previous crop is non-winter wheat. But if you look at right-hand side, where we had continuous wheat, you can see here is producing in most of the situation lowest yield. So anyway, I will just go to the next slide. And my objective is to highlight gross margin. We do want to grow a range of different crops. For example, we want to grow maybe, as Lydia mentioned, hemp or other crops such as, for example, linseed or peas and beans. End of the day, as an agronomist and as a farmer, we all talk about gross margin. Is it profitable crop? So this data, which is in front of your screen now, is based on the price in 2020. On my left-hand side, I have highlighted few crops anyway. On my left-hand side, first winter wheat, and I'm assuming 9-ton yield, produce the highest gross margin based on input cost, variable input cost. And then you can see the second highest gross margin we managed to achieve from a maize crop, which produced roughly 36 ton fresh weight. And then spring beans, for example, and oilseed rape was the highest was the crop which produced the highest gross margin at 3.5 ton per hectare yield. So as we know, Jim mentioned that oilseed rape is becoming increasingly difficult to grow because of some flea beetle. So now people talking about alternate crops or alternate break crops. And now there is increasing interest in growing beans and peas, spring linseed, winter linseed. Some people talking about chickpea, some people growing some other crops. Lydia mentioned about soya. So all these crops, we can grow them, but we also need to remember whether we can drill them at the right time. Can we harvest them at the right time? So I have a range of crops, and you can see on the screen. I'm not going to go through all of them. You can take a picture of the screen if you want to, but it's actually showing us that what's the ideal drilling date, when is the ideal or expected harvest date. For example, soya, if you drill them, I've been growing soya on one farm, not particularly me, but one of my clients, and we were struggling to harvest soya at the right time. When I say right time, it means we couldn't harvest them even mid-October. And when people were actually drilling winter wheat, we were thinking about harvesting soya. So harvesting or crop maturity can be a really difficult task if we do not choose the right variety of all these underutilized or break crops. But I just thought maybe highlight that there are a range of crops which we can grow, but probably sometimes they are not ideal or they don't fit in a rotation. Now, when we talk about growing these break crops or underutilized crops, the first important thing comes in our mind is, can I sell it? So is there any market? The next important thing is yield. Although people would say that I want to achieve highest yield, but end of the day, gross margin matters, because you will have to apply more nutrients, more fertilizer, more fungicide, herbicides to achieve yield. But gross margin is the key. And how much money you are going to spend, so for example, variable cost. And again, the output price, like for example, winter wheat, current price is, grain price is maybe 210 per ton. 4 or 5 years ago, it was around 120, 110 pound per ton. So that actually dictates your gross margin and profit and how much nutrients or inputs you want to apply. So one thing is, people tend to ask, okay, fine, I want to grow beans, I want to grow, for example, peas, linseed, and chickpea, for example. How can I actually maximize my gross margin? So the one thing which I always say is that maximize input use efficiency. How much fertilizer do you need to apply? How much nitrogen and timing of all these fertilizer inputs? But another thing is that yield is not dictated by just inputs. It's also dictated by crop choice, by varieties. Obviously, inputs are important, but soil type, what establishment techniques you are using, and the biggest uncertain things are the challenging thing is season. In some year, we tend to get rain at appropriate time. Sometimes it's dry season, sometimes it's very wet season. So that can have a significant effect on crop establishment, either after soya, for example, or even after oilseed rape, because if you grow or drill your wheat after oilseed rape, and if it's very wet season, you will have a lot of slug pressure or slug damage. Now, one thing which people tend to ask always is, do biostimulants have a role in the establishment of crop? And again, I would mention Jim mentioned about yield plateau of certain crops, especially winter wheat, and people talking about using biostimulants and other snake oils to improve yield and maybe crop establishment. I always advise or maybe suggest to my clients that if people come on your farm and try to sell these snake oils, ask for the data. Do they have any reliable data? Unfortunately, there is not reliable data to recommend on farms. But I'm not going to say that all biostimulants are rubbish or snake oils. There are few biostimulants, they do actually work, but 90% of them, they are just waste of space. Anyway, I'm not going to define what biostimulants is. You can see on the screen, and if you want to take a picture, you can take a picture of the screen as well. The problem with biostimulant at the moment is that there is no legal or regulatory definition of biostimulants. Different people tend to name their product as a biostimulant. Some people trying to sell silicon-based product as a biostimulant. Some people are trying to sell, for example, phosphide-based product as a biostimulant. So it will be standardized, and people will know what is biostimulant and what is not. But again, I'm just trying to highlight the differences between fertilizer, pesticide, and biostimulant and their regulatory pathway. Unfortunately, or fortunately, for some people, the regulation for biostimulant is not really well established at the moment. But for pesticide, there are high level of requirement in terms of their efficacy, in terms of their effect on humans, in terms of their effect on marine life. Similarly, fertilizer are somewhere in the middle between pesticide and biostimulants. So I will very quickly show what's the situation currently within the UK in terms of biostimulants. So biostimulants do not have to be authorized or registered as long as they do not claim any direct effect on pests and diseases. So which means that I can tomorrow produce a biostimulant and sell it as long as I do not claim that they have any effect on pests and diseases. So what people sell by biostimulant is that they say that improves abiotic stress. They would say it improves crop tolerance to diseases and crop tolerance to pests, but they are not claiming that they actually have a direct effect. So you can sell any biostimulants. So what's currently happening in the UK and Ireland, that mixture of biostimulants can be sold under the fertilizer regulations. Only the nutrient content needs to be declared on the label. It is not necessary to validate the claims of biostimulants. So for example, if you buy a biostimulant, as long as they're not claiming that it increases yield, you can sell your biostimulants. As long as your biostimulant doesn't say that it is going to control diseases, you can sell that so-called product as a biostimulant. But it is going to change from July 2022. So any product which is sold in the UK or in the EU under the name of biostimulant, and if they are making any claims, they will have to prove that that claim which they are claiming on the label. So for example, if a manufacturer is claiming that actually improves nutrient use efficiency, they will have to produce the data to back up that claim. If people say that this biostimulant increases yield, they will have to produce the data to back up their claims. So going forward, thing will change. So again, I'm in this screen, I'm showing you a range of biostimulants which we have tested with the NAB tag, and I will show you some of the data. Unfortunately, most of the data we have got is on winter wheat. We tried on spring barley, we tried on some peas and beans. So far, the data is not good enough to recommend or to suggest that these products actually are working. But I will show you some of the data on winter wheat. This is one of the screenshot of some of the claims, especially from Amino A Flow, which they are claiming that their seed dressing can increase yield of cereals and beans. And I would say that yes, under certain situation, I have seen the benefit of certain seed treatments, and Amino A Flow has shown some benefit in our trials, but not all biostimulants actually work. So I will show you some of the data. Those who are NAB tag members, they might have seen this report anyway, but I will show you very quickly the data from 2018 harvest. On the screen, you can see that we have used a range of biostimulant. Nutified PGA is actually a phosphide-based product. Zonda and Bridgeway, they are amino acid-based products. And Terrasoap is again another amino acid-based product. On the screen, you can see that none of these biostimulants had any effect on the yield. Obviously, you would say this is only 1 year data. We should repeat that in trial again. So we repeated this trial in 2019. And again, you can see there's no significant effect of any of the biostimulants. So which means that I could say all these biostimulants are rubbish, they do not work, but we should ask ourselves, and the question we should ask, although there was no significant effect of any of the biostimulants, but maybe that we didn't apply these biostimulants at the right time. Maybe we used a robust fungicide program, which meant that biostimulant, the benefit of using biostimulants were not observed in these trials. So what did we do was, we repeated these kind of treatments in a range of range of biostimulants, and we reduced the fungicide rate. So here you can see on the screen, we have used only, on my left-hand side, we have used fungicide at T2 and T3 timing, which means growth stage 39 and growth stage 59 for those people actually are not agronomists. And then we use biostimulant at T0 and T1, which means growth stage 30 and growth stage 31, 32. Here you can see that amino acid-based product, Kelpac and Cereal Plus, they had a positive effect on yield compared to the plots which didn't receive any fungicide or any biostimulant. All of these plots had received fungicide at T2 and T3 timing. But interestingly, if you look at the right-hand side, where we use a 4-spray program, which means fungicide was applied at T0 and T1, none of the biostimulant had effect on the yield. This data is from high disease pressure year in Devon area, Carlo. We repeated same treatments at Sutton Scotney near Dorset. And here you can see none of the biostimulant had any effect on the grain yield of winter wheat. So probably what we could say is that, okay, in high disease pressure area or maybe areas where disease pressure is really high, you can use biostimulants with low fungicide inputs. So those people actually are interested to reduce their reliance on fungicides. Some people might say fungicides are bad for soil biology. Some people might say they are not good for environment. So I want to reduce my reliance on fungicides, which means that yes, biostimulants can replace in some situation or reduce the reliance on fungicide based on this data. So we also did some work at Cirencester, but I'm slightly conscious of the time. The take-home message, which I have already repeated, said anyway, but if you want to take a picture of the screen, please do so. Based on these two slides, we can conclude that biostimulants have a place under low or zero fungicide input system, which means that we can use certain biostimulants to reduce our reliance on fungicides. Very quickly, we did some work at Cirencester, which is a drought-prone soil, and we thought that we will be able to see the benefits of certain biostimulants. The reason is that biostimulants can improve rooting, and hence we probably could reduce our reliance on fertilizer inputs. I will just very quickly introduce the fungicide treatments. So when I say 50% of the fungicide, which means we use low rate of certain fungicide at T1 and T2, while and then we use and we increase the rate from 0.4 to 0.8 or Ascrax Pro 0.5 to 1 liters. And here in the screen, on the screen, you can see on my left-hand side, fully untreated plots produce around 7.5 ton yield. Where we use half rate of fungicide, we had around 8.7 ton, and where we use full rate of fungicide, we had around 9.2 ton. But interesting thing to see is that where we use half rate of fungicide and replace that fungicide with amino A at T0 and T1, we were able to achieve same yield as full rate of fungicide. On my right hand side, where we use amino A flow again slightly later, again, same result, which actually confirming that if we use certain biostimulants, they can reduce our reliance on fungicide. But again, 1 year data, maybe low disease pressure year 2020, we were able to see the benefit of these biostimulants under low fungicide input system. Question would be what happened in 2021? So we repeated all these treatments in 2021. And what we found that there was no significant effect of any of the biostimulant except cereal alloy, which is based on trace elements, which is in green color. So this tends to suggest that although biostimulants have a place in terms of reducing their reliance, our reliance on fungicide, but their effects are not always significant and are consistent. So therefore, we need to be really careful in terms of making decision whether we should be using biostimulants and reduce our reliance on fungicide. Another thing which I wanted to highlight is that do biostimulants justify their cost? Yes, if you use low rate of fungicides, based on the data which we had from previous year, biostimulant did justify their cost and they produce same gross margin as full rate of fungicide. But as I said before, that not all biostimulants have a positive effect, as you can see from this trial or the screen, that we have used a range of biostimulants and they are showing sometimes inconsistent effect. So amino A flow has been so far the best one, followed by, I would say, Bridgeway. So Bridgeway and amino A flow are showing some consistent benefits in our NIOP tag trial. Very quickly, I will show you some of the data on soil applied bacteria, which we have been doing over the last 3 years. And these soil applied bacteria, which are SR3, they have got 4 different types of bacteria, which you get in a small sachet. And you can actually apply soon after drilling, but ideally you should be applying when soil temperature is warm enough. for these bacteria to multiply. So I will show you very quickly the data. We had a range of nitrogen treatments, 0, which means no nitrogen was applied, 125 kilogram of nitrogen, 175 and 250. So blue bars actually showing you the effect of nitrogen rate. And you probably can tell that nitrogen was not a yield limiting factors when we look at the rate of nitrogen rate. As nitrogen rate increased from 125 to 175, no significant improvement in yield. Even at 250, no improvement in yield, statistical significance, I mean. So no significant difference between 125 and 250. But the interesting thing to see is that where we use SR3, which is soil plant bacteria, there was almost 0.55 ton response in terms of yield. Now, I would question myself, although nitrogen was not a yield limiting factor, why soil plant bacteria increase the yield? So could be that plant prefer the nitrogen which is released by the bacteria, and therefore they were able to utilize that nitrogen more efficiently, and the effect was translated into yield. But again, 1 year data, we tried another year, we had slightly different results because we didn't apply at the right time. But all these products, biostimulants, they can be used in some situation. As people say, horses for courses. If you want to use biostimulant, if you want to use soil applied bacteria, you probably need to reduce your soil applied nitrogen. You probably need to reduce your reliance on fungicide or reduce the fungicide rate. So then you can use biostimulants. Very quickly, I show you QLF Boost, which is again carbon-based fertilizer, and applies provides some sugar, which means when you apply this product, it will, especially in high organic matter, it will allow bacteria or biology to multiply quickly, and then they can release nitrogen. We have done some work with this product, and we have seen some interesting benefit, especially under low fertilizer input system. So again, I would say conclusion slides maybe. Can biostimulant improve crop establishment? So as I mentioned before, we haven't done a lot of work on underutilized crop. We have done work on spring barley. Phosphide-based seed dressing tends to improve crop establishment, early crop establishment, especially in cold spring. Similarly, manganese seed dressing have shown to have some benefit. When I say benefit, which means early crop vigor, bigger leaf size, they look slightly forward, especially on manganese deficient soil. Similarly, we have tried certain amino acid based seed dressing. They have shown some benefit in cereals as well as in legumes. But end of the day, all these products should justify their cost. But the problem is that their positive effect in terms of vigor, in terms of establishment, their effects do not necessarily translate into yield. And that is the biggest problem. So I will just very quickly show you the take-home message slide. So the problem, it's not a problem. Maybe we are probably not using the right variety. There are varieties which probably respond differently to trace elements, varieties which respond differently to biostimulants. But in our trials, we haven't been able to see the benefit of biostimulant, like consistent benefit of biostimulants. Sometimes we see the benefit, but we try again, we don't see them. So they are inconsistent and unpredictable. And as I said before, that they are not repeatable. Like we tried in 1 year and we saw the benefit, we tried again, we didn't see the benefit. So I would say that they, so far in our trials within NAPTAG, we have found aminoaflow, another biostimulant called chlorophyll, and another product called T6P have shown some benefits which are consistent over the last 2 years, but we need to do more work on these trials. And again, we are trialing all these products on peas and beans and chickpea as well, linseed, and naked oats. So if you had any question about these products and how we can use them on these crops, please drop me an email or something. So I think, Belinda, I would just say thank you very much for listening. And if there are any questions, whether we want to do separately or as a panel, up to you, Belinda. I will stop here.
Thank you. Great, Syed, thank you so much. There actually has been a question come in from David Newton. How many of the biostimulants to which you referred have been approved in the EU? Do you have a sense of any, some, more?
Within the EU, I would say I would only know about the UK. So there are some biostimulants which have been introduced by BASF. There are some biostimulants which have been introduced by Bayer. They have proper label. They have gone through regulation system like CRD. There are some introduced by Corteva. So they do have a place, and they have, but we haven't done a lot of work on those products.
Okay.
How many are, but from July 2022, we would know more.
Okay, that's helpful. And we'll give David one more opportunity. He has another question. What about NUE? I'm assuming, David, that's nitrogen use efficiency. Have you looked at that at all, Syed, in any of these?
Yes. We did some work on product which was from TMARC Agro, and it shows some benefit in terms of increasing yield as well as grain protein. So yes, sir, there are certain products which you can use to reduce our reliance on nitrogen fertilizer and increase nitrogen use efficiency. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Can I invite Jim and Lydia to come back in the room, please? Because it would be good to just continue this theme around sort of biostimulants. And I'm thinking particularly this kind of soil microbiota. Lydia, have you got any thoughts on this from what we've just heard from Syed about the role of kind of fungicides? You know, antibiotics for humans and animals aren't great because it affects gut microbiota. Have you got any thoughts on the role of fungicides in this?
Yeah, one thing I'd like to say is we've recently finished a PhD project looking at what's the role of mycorrhizal fungi in enabling nutrient sequestration under arable conditions following various treatments. We're particularly interested in cover crops, which obviously are introduced to improve soil quality and structure and health and so forth. As is inevitably the case, PhDs go off a little bit sometimes in different directions. And the thing that we looked at was the microbial biodiversity with respect to mycorrhizae. So this is kind of not the opposite to what Syed's saying. It's what's already there as opposed to what you're bringing in deliberately. And you know, we were very worried that we were not going to get sufficiently interesting results from sites that are being heavily treated with fungicides, being, you know, fungal in themselves. We didn't see that really. We sometimes saw a reduction in mycorrhizal quantity. We hardly saw any difference in mycorrhizal biodiversity. The main difference that we got that made a massive difference in biodiversity, I'm not talking about the amount of colonization and interaction with the crop, which is a separate issue, but that was much reduced by disturbance. And so disturbance in terms of how you establish the crop, but also disturbance in terms of what you did prior to that establishment. Yeah. That had an effect on biodiversity. So this is slightly different because we didn't get effect actually on the total colonization in terms of that, nor, and as I say, not in terms of fungicide use, because I suspect that some of our participants will think, well, you know, if you're having a high input conventional system, then obviously, as it were, in inverted commas, you're not going to get quite the impact from these biostimulants that you might. But I don't think you can actually assume that. I think there will be things that will differ, and Syed has said it several times that, you know, if we're not putting it on under ideal situations or at the right time or whatever, then it may be we won't get a positive response from some of these biostimulant inputs that we would do if we had I hesitate to define it because we don't know the answer, but perhaps if we had a more stable crop with a lower input regime.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, go ahead, sorry.
Well, you can't jump to these, and this is why it's really important. I mean, I imagine some of our participants are disheartened to hear the lack of differences with these products, but you know, you have to go with the data. You have to find out if you are getting an impact, and if a farmer has a 1 or 2% margin, and they're expected to pay for of course, the person who's making the biostimulant needs to make a profit too. But if you're not getting any impact at all on your infrastructure, for want of a better word, i.e. your soil, nor your crop yields, then you have to ask the question whether there's actually a point in doing this.
I was thinking about this through Syed's talk. I mean, presumably all of these products are grounded in having shown an effect at some point, a positive effect. And I'm wondering whether there are any other factors at play here, whether it's that farmers who have particular attention to detail, or as we were hearing from Jim, soil types, things like that, whether there are any other factors, maybe even that are not quite so easily measurable, that could have just been the kernel of why some of these products are marketed and have shown success in some hands in some circumstances.
Yeah, can I come back? And I'm sure Jim's got something to say on this, and of course Syed does. So I looked at introduction of various different biostimulants to soya, because I think soya is a fascinating crop. Again, some people don't like it, but if we're looking at reducing protein inputs, and if people don't want to have GM soya for whatever reason, then growing our own soya that's non-GM would make sense if you want to have a sustainable source of protein. But soya does respond very well to additions. So my friends at Soya UK wouldn't dream of issuing any soya seed to their farmers without an already added rhizobium inoculant, because that makes a huge difference. So let's not get the different types of stimulant confused. I wouldn't buy a stimulant, by the way. We've also looked at mycorrhizal inoculants, and I have very frustratingly had 3 years running a very positive impact of introducing mycorrhizal inoculants, not only in terms of good establishment, but good synchronicity of flowering, which is exactly what the farm needs. But when I did it at field scale, in a fully replicated project, I didn't get any impact. And, I was getting an impact, as I say, 3 years running, but it wasn't as statistically validated. So, okay, I did the job properly, and then I didn't get it, which is super frustrating. So we don't really know how these things are behaving, and there are a lot of soil issues that we need to understand. Over to you, Jim.
Yeah, let's let Jim. I can see you smiling, Jim.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Just to start with fungicides and soil biology, CRD has a very thorough evaluation process for this, and I sat on their advisory committee pesticides between 1996 and 2002, when a lot of the current fungicides were approved, and they all had to be screened for effect on soil fungi. And I can't obviously give you individual results, but some did affect diversity and level of soil respiration and soil fungi and its diversity, but usually within a month, it was back to normal. So there is a short-term effect, possibly, not necessarily long-term effect. So that's one thing. And in terms of identifying reasons for specific inputs working one occasion, not another, you've only got to look at nitrogen. If you looked at nitrogen results on cereals, on wheat, hundreds of results and no consistency, and we just don't know why. So if we can't do that with our major nutrient, what chances of doing for individual sort of products? It may be there's a key in there somewhere, and there must be, but whether we identify it or not is another matter.
Yeah. Thank you, Jim. Syed, did you have any before we move on to a different topic? Any final comments on this?
No, I would say, I would repeat again myself what I said before, and I would agree with Lydia and Jim that all biostimulants which are being used, are supported, are promoted within the UK, they do have a place under certain situation. Do not, we are not saying that they don't work. As I said before, horses for courses. If you feel that your soil or your crop is needing extra rooting help, phosphate-based products can help. Some biostimulants can actually improve some tolerance against certain diseases. So again, I would say they have a place, but their effects are not always consistent. So
okay.
Shut up.
Alrighty.
Yeah.
Thank you. Can I just change gear a little bit? Jim, you mentioned the role of the breeders, and I'd like to, we talk to breeders quite a lot, and they're saying, we can breed anything, but who's going to pay us to do it? So given the kind of critical role of the breeders, and where, Lydia, your short list, when you come up with it, there's presumably going to have to be a conversation with breeders to help make these existing varieties a bit more agronomically cooperative, shall we say. So first of all, are the breeders involved in your project, Lydia, and how do you envisage that conversation happening? And then Jim, in your experience, what were the messages to those breeders?
Okay, so absolutely, in the various workshops that we've been doing, that we've done already, and those that we propose to do, the farmers and breeders are absolutely our sort of key stakeholders. Yeah. And government is watching this work very closely. DEFRA's funding some work, as I said, on looking at underutilized crops, and they want to know, what are the drivers? What are the main key things that are preventing a crop from actually going from being a potential to a reality? So breeding is absolutely paramount, and to go back to soy, because we've all used it as an example, it's quite a useful one. As both Jim and Syed said, 10-15 years ago, soy was a bit of a non-starter because you could grow it okay, but it was just too late, and so it was a bit of a disaster in the rotation. But every single year, particularly because there's a lot of breeding input from the USA as well as parts of Europe, the tolerance of soya to going in a bit earlier becomes better. And so they've actually designated soy, for example, they give it a number, and it used to be sort of 3, 2, 1, and then it went 0. Because they keep getting better, they're going 00, 000. I think we're at least quadruple 0 now in terms of cold tolerance. And now the area of soya cultivation is going up to the point where it's a sort of a proper crop, if you like. It's still quite minor, but I think it's got lots of potential. So you could say that the combination of genetics going up and climate change going down is we're getting a bit warmer, and so you've got a little bit of there. So genetics absolutely vital. The thing with soya again is that we've got a lot of chemistry. Okay, if you're an organic farmer, that doesn't help, but if you're conventional, very least low input, we've got some chemistry to deal with some of the main difficulties with respect to weeds and so forth. If you've got an absolutely brand new crop, it's tricky because it's potentially expensive, and Jim and Syed can talk much better than I can on this in terms of getting them accepted for use with a new crop. And that's tricky and expensive, and that will be, one of the issues that will hold it back, and that just needs a bit of work and testing and safety and all the things that we would expect for using chemistry in any particular situation. I feel I should hand over to the two input experts on that score. I start feeling nervous.
Can we just stay on the breeding, Jim? What would be what's the business model going to be for commercial production of some of the underutilized crops that Lydia might discover hold the key to future diversity?
Well, the business model is to get some money behind the breeding effort to a certain extent. Also to look at the natural variation within that species. And obviously, if you've got a wide variation in the background, the better chance you are to actually make significant improvements. So it's a question of doing a bit of background research on variation, natural variation, listening to Lydia on the possibilities of the crop commercially, and then getting some money behind that, because with breeding, all things are possible, particularly with the newer breeding methods. Yeah. So whether they're accepted or not, I don't know, but certainly ACRE, the government committee that advises government on sort of breeding measurements or methods, I should say, have recently relaxed their rules on genetic engineering in terms of site selection and site use. So you don't have to declare where the site is and things like that. So there is a bit of prompting from government, but government to go further has got to change its primary legislation on breeding to introduce these new breeding methods.
And is there the understanding of that natural variation? I mean, is that a BBSRC that funds a lot of the agricultural and non-medical bioscience in the UK? Who should hold the pen on that hunt for that natural variation and understanding the germplasm for these types
I'll pass over to Lydia, who will probably say she could do it.
Well, gosh, it's a nice little project, and I think, you know, it would be good to use ahi flour actually as an example here. So I did mention this in my examples, and it just happened to be one that I personally worked on. So ahi was previously known as field gromwell. People might recognize that name better, or Buglosoides. And when we first started, it was just a scruffy little weed that you found in second wheats. When we really looked into it, we found that the biodiversity, so going back to Jim's point, was extremely low. The genetic diversity was very, very low. And only when we went back to look around other parts of Europe and really got a much broader and deeper diversity, were we able to deal with a lot of the issues that we found with the crop. Like, for example, dormancy, which was a big issue with it. Like, for example, whether you could drill it as a autumn crop as opposed to a spring crop. So that, I think, you know, if you're starting off with a new crop, as Jim said, I absolutely condone that. Diversity, genetic diversity, the pool in which you're fishing as a breeder is vital. And so, yes, it's vital, as you said, Belinda, that we engage with the breeders right from the start and that they get involved with any initiative, because there's people like, there's organizations like NIAB that will engage in pre-breeding, but ultimately we need to get involved with the breeders, whether large or small, to take this out and make it into a finished crop, and of course to deal with all the agronomic issues.
Indeed. Okay, I'm seeing that the clock is against us. We have 2 minutes. So in the closing stages, I'm going to be a little bit mean because I haven't pre-warned the speakers about this. I'd like you to imagine, which if we were in person, there is a chance that the Secretary of State may have joined us at the conference and may have been in the conference listening to this. Let's hope and imagine. So I'd like to go to the speakers in the order in which they spoke. So Lydia, I'm afraid you first, and then Jim, and then Syed. What would be your one-sentence message to the Secretary of State around enhancing the utilisation of these underrepresented crops? Lydia, one sentence, please.
So we absolutely need more protein. Farmers have been calling out for this, and I think putting some resources and help behind developing protein crops in the UK, and that's not just development from the lab point or the field point of view, but also from the legislative point of view, to enable taking those crops through the system sufficiently quickly that a farmer can actually get to grow them. Brilliant,
thank you. Jim, your wish list for the Secretary of State, please. One sentence.
I would have chosen the same thing. We do need proteins. So I very much agree with Lydia. And obviously they need to be smart with their investment in terms of future crops, because I think the whole industry would gain from that.
Excellent. 2 votes for protein crops. Syed, you have.
And I would say we need more support in terms of research, because we are relying heavily on manufacturers and distribution in terms of doing research. If there's no market, if we can't sell it, we can't do the research. So we need support, research supports, where we can try different agronomy and make maybe breeding and other other techniques a bit more simple rather than more, like very corporate and red. Like it's quite difficult sometimes. So it makes it a bit easier for us to do the research. I would just shut up now.
Okay.
Could I just add a second line? Particularly think of clay soils. We need more diversity of cropping on clay soils.
Okay. Well, thank you, Jim. And if anybody listening has hotlines into regulators and policymakers, you heard it here from some of the most esteemed people in the UK with their views. So please disseminate those messages. So it just falls for me to say thank you very much to Jim, to Lydia, to Syed, and to the organisers of the conference. It's been an absolute pleasure to be part of the things today. What a pity we weren't in person in Oxford, hopefully next year. But in the meantime, I'd like to thank you for your attention. Please stay in touch with the speakers. You've seen their email addresses. Reach out to them, and I'm sure they'd be happy to continue the conversation on a different platform. But for now, thank you very much for your attention, and we'll close the session. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Belinda. Bye.
Right.